Is it okay for the church to get involved in the public arena? Should Christians be actively involved in the free elections of the United States of America? Faith Wins is an organization dedicated to engaging pastors, congregations, and Christians in the public arena. Why, you may ask? Because the influence of Christians needs to be felt around this country. Jesus is the solution, and we need to bring biblical solutions to the marketplace of ideas before it's too late, and we need to do it now. There are over 80 million eligible Christian voters in this country, but only 30 million regularly participate in the elections. This needs to change, and Chad Connelly is going to tell you why in just a minute. Check us out online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. When we sit on the sidelines and hope for a better future, the enemy wins. When we mobilize, register, and make our voices heard, faith wins every time. Hey, thanks for tuning in today to the Faith Wins podcast. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I'm joined today by Faith Wins founder, Chad Connelly. Chad, I can't wait for our conversation today. This is going to be a fun one.
This is a fun one, and probably the one that people out in the world know the most about, or the least about, or apply it the most wrong, right?
But yeah, the most wrong, right? That's great. Okay. So we're going through the 5 major objections that you get when you approach a pastor about allowing Faith Wins to help them set up a voter registration drive. And we're so excited about getting voter registration driven throughout Christianity because of this one statistic you shared on one of our very first podcasts. There are 82 million eligible Christian voters in this country, 30 million of which are actually active in voting, 30 million of which are registered but are not inactive in voting, and 20 plus million that are not even registered to vote. And that's a problem because that 82 million represents the largest voting bloc in the country. We would control every office in the country with conservative biblical-based values if Christians just voted. Did I?
Amen. It's the truth, and it's sad. It's really sad. It shows you it's our responsibility, and we failed at it. So yeah, that's the whole purpose of Faith Wins, is maximize the Christian vote at every level. And I'll bet you most Christians who are sitting in church who don't like what's going on at their school board, their county council, a lot of the people that'll say, I don't like what's going on, but by those statistics, it shows us a lot of them just aren't voting. We know they're not voting, and we got to push them and make sure they understand the importance.
But Chad, there's this issue of the church not getting involved in the state. That's really where the issue comes in. It's a law or something, isn't it?
Well, there's no question about it that this is one of the big objections. I rated it number 2 in my non-scientific study, traveling around the country, speaking in churches, to pastor groups and organizations, faith leaders. The number 2 objection I got was, well, Chad, the separation of church and state, so we just can't talk about that stuff in the pulpit. It is absolutely something a lot of people believe, and they don't even know the source of it, Jim.
Okay, so let's talk about the source of it, because it is the number 1 fallacy in the arguments across the halls of Congress.
Yeah,
okay,
it really is.
So this came from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote.
That's right. This came from a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote years later, 1801. He writes this years after the Constitutional Convention took place in 1787. The Constitution signed in 1789. Jefferson wasn't even present. He was in France as a visiting minister. He was an ambassador type person at the time. And so the Danbury Baptists wrote a letter to the President Thomas Jefferson, saying, look, you're not going to create some national religion, right? We don't want a national church. That's what we just got rid of in England with the Church of England. We don't want the rules and regulations coming down from on high. We want to continue with freedom of worship. So Jefferson wrote a private letter back to the Danbury Baptists, reassuring them that there was a wall of separation between church and state and that there would never be a national religion. Now, when you read the whole letter, Jim, it makes sense. Jefferson was correct. The government's not going to create a national church that you must attend and you must follow. You're going to have the freedom to worship. He describes it well. But in 1947, an ACLU lawyer lifted the phrase wall of separation between church and state and began misapplying that in Supreme Court rulings. Now, from 1789 to 1947, Jefferson was quoted only 3 times in Supreme Court decisions that used a founder and the Constitution because he wasn't there. He might have had some comments that they applied 3 times. Since 1947, it's been used over 1,000 times because of the precedent that was set in that 1947 decision. I think it was the Everson decision. And there's a book I want to recommend that all Christians read. It's called The Wall of Separation Between Church and State by Daniel Driesbach.
Hold that up for the camera.
I'm going to hold it up. It's okay. Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State. Daniel Driesbach, I've probably read 25 books on this subject. This is probably the one that cuts through the clutter the most for me personally. It's not a hard read or anything. It's not academic, but he does go through all those details if people want to follow that. But when you see it being misapplied, now it is pretty much jurisprudence for the Supreme Court, the wall of separation between church and state. That misapplication of a private letter taken out of context years after the Constitution was written and signed by somebody who wasn't even there. So that's what 4 or 5 things that should disqualify the phrase. Here's the next thing that disqualifies the phrase, okay? And then we're going to talk about what really it should be. The words wall of separation between church and state are not found in any American founding document, not the Articles of Confederation, not the Declaration of Independence, not the United States Constitution, not the Bill of Rights. No founding document. They are found, however. They're found in 2 places that I've found in my research, and Driesbach and people like David Barton helped me on this with reading their books. There are 2 sources I've found for the phrase wall of separation between church and state. The United Nations Charter, which happened around 1947, coincidentally, and the former Constitution of the USSR. The former Soviet Union's Constitution mentioned a wall of separation between church and state. So did the United Nations Charter. No American document. It's not anywhere. You know, I'm not a betting person. I don't believe in gambling, but I'll speak sometimes and I'll carry a $100 bill with me if I know I'm in a secular audience, and I'll mention this. And inevitably, some liberal person that's been in public school too long and listened to some pointy-head nerd liberal leftist professor, he'll come up and say, "You're lying, that's not true." And I'll pull out my copy of the Constitution and I'll say, "Listen, I'm not a betting person, but since I'm going to take your money, it's 100% guaranteed, I'm going to put my $100 down. And if you can find wall of separation between church and state in the U.S. Constitution or any other founding document, you get to keep my $100. But because I've already warned you, I'm going to take your $100 because you should have looked it up before you made such a boastful statement." I mean, it's never been wrong.
Of course, because nothing changes. That doesn't change. It wasn't Jefferson's original thing was protecting the church from the state, not the state from the church, because the state was established by the church. Our government was established on the free exercise of religion, and our government was established on God, our creator, who gave us inalienable rights. I mean, it all was founded on God. We didn't want a separation because we knew who was it that said when we separate our relationship with our Heavenly Father from our government, who said that would bring about a disaster? Was that Washington that said that?
I don't know that quote. I've heard it
before. No, that's not a quote. That's
a
Jim paraphrase.
Yeah, it's a Jim paraphrase. Many of the founders said things referencing the exact same type of statement. Washington, Jefferson, certainly Hamilton, others, John Jay, the Federalist Papers talk about it. It doesn't take much of an honest reading of the founders' quotes in diaries and journals to find out that the wall of separation between church and state has been misapplied completely. And if you look at what's going on, if you find a liberal judge anywhere in America the last 50 years, they've applied it wrongly. They've totally applied it wrongly. They don't want any religious reference. I mean, if you think about it, the First Amendment goes back into it too. The founders were so concerned about this being wrong that in the First Amendment, they said, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," yada, yada, yada. Now it's become high school principals or an offended atheist or a county council person. The First Amendment doesn't say that an offended atheist can walk by a display of the 10 Commandments, and because of separation of church and state, that has to be removed. But that's how it's being done. An atheist can drive by the Mojave Desert Cross put there by World War I veterans 100 years ago, and they can be offended by it. It's got to go because of separation between church and state because it's on public property. That's not what the First Amendment says. And instead of us pushing back and fighting that, Christians have let it go largely. And that's another thing I think pastors ought to be teaching in the pulpit, is America was founded on the principles of a Judeo-Christian biblical foundation. It's undeniable. You don't have to do a lot of reading. In fact, in 1986, the University of Houston did a study, Jim, and they analyzed, man, where did the founders get these incredibly new ideas? I mean, how'd they come up with separation of powers or representative republic form of government? How did they come up with this stuff? And you realize it's from the Bible. And so the University of Houston study in 1986 analyzed 15,000 separate writings of the founders, not hearsay, like Jefferson's quote, not from people not there, but from their writings. They found that the number one quoted source in the Constitutional Convention from June 1787 until September 1787 was the Bible, 34%. The second source was Montesquieu's book, The Commentary on the Law, and then John Locke's two treatises of civil government. Those three documents, those two books in the Bible, were over 60% of all the sources that the founders used to quote. John Locke's two treatises of civil government, got on my shelf up there. You have 1,700 biblical references to how you form a civil government. Montesquieu was required reading in every law class in every law school until the 1920s, and the humanists took it out. So it just takes a little bit of honest reading of the founders' actual words to realize we've been lied to. It's been glossed over. It's been covered up. You've not been told the truth. And, it's why I advocate reading so much. These pastors, faith leaders, deacons, Sunday school teachers, you got to be reading true American history, or you can't tell the story of America, and you can't tell how God's worked in this entire world.
So bring us back to the mission of Faith Wins and this conversation with a local pastor who says that they can't hold a local voter registration drive in their church.
Yep. Well, they use the separation of church and state. And again, we talked about this on other podcasts. The first thing is the relationship. Once I have a relationship with them, I can direct them to the sources that make them read and study. Once I have a relationship with them, then I can expand their web and their network and use the leverage of their relationship to reach other people who have been taught wrongly. This is our responsibility. I'm not a pastor, but I'm a deacon and a Sunday school teacher. This falls on us to go teach people the truth. And if a pastor is hiding behind, that wall of separation between church and state, when you obliterate their thinking on that and you remove that as an excuse, you've now given them what they need to say, oh, I can run a non-partisan voter registration drive. Listen, we know the facts. The facts and the truth are on our side here, Jim. We know that every church in America can and should hold nonpartisan voter registration drives every single year. Every year. Christians ought to be voting in maximum numbers in every election, up and down the ticket, local, state, city, and federal elections all the time. The fact that we're not in such big numbers is why the country's gone off the skids in so many directions. If somebody is not a Christian and they don't have a biblical worldview, then they're always going to think people have the answers. See, a biblical worldview to me in regard to this comes down to one thing, is ultimately every decision, every argument, every piece of discussion in every hall of Congress, every state legislature comes down to one question: who says? Who says? There are only two answers: man says or God says. Only two answers. When man says, he's always going to fall short because he believes man's good. When we believe God says, we know man's not good. There are going to have to be checks and balances because man needs a sinner. A perfect, imperfect, unholy, unrighteous man cannot get the holy, perfect God except through the perfection of Jesus' substitutionary sacrifice on the cross. And so the humanist side of man believes he has all the answers. That's where we've gone wrong in the country when pastors aren't teaching the truth. We've got to get them back to a biblical worldview, holding voter registration and understanding that this idea of the wall of separation of church and state it's been wrongly applied by somebody who wasn't even there years after the fact, and it's been taken out of context by people who purposefully don't want the church involved.
Well said. Thank you, Chad Connelly.
Thank you, Jim.
And remember that when you register to vote and you vote your biblical values alongside your biblical worldview, faith wins. Hey, thanks for listening to the Faith Wins podcast with Faith Wins founder, Chad Connelly. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I want to ask you to check out Faith Wins online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. Your vote is needed and necessary, and we all need to learn to engage in our system of free elections right here in the United States of America. If you're not registered to vote, please take time to do so on your local county voter registration website and do it today. In an upcoming election, vote for candidates supporting biblical values and a biblical worldview. Until next time, remember, when Christians engage in the public arena, faith wins.